January 17, 1945, Southern England, 03:47 hours. The night sky above Kent trembled with a sound that had become grimly familiar to the civilians huddled in their Anderson shelters below. Not the drone of Luftwaffe bombers, those had grown rare by the war's fifth winter, but something else, a mechanical pulse, rhythmic, relentless. The distinctive puttering roar of a Fieseler V-103, what the British had nicknamed the Doodlebug, what propaganda minister Goebbels called the Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1, the V-1 flying bomb. In the darkness, Royal Observer Corps spotters tracked the red glow of its pulse jet engine as it crossed the Channel coast at 350 miles per hour. They could hear it clearly now, that stuttering mechanical heartbeat growing louder, closer, and then silence. The engine cut. Somewhere below, mothers pulled their children tighter. Somewhere above, the 1-ton warhead began its terminal descent, obeying only gravity and the targeting calculations made by technicians in Peenemünde weeks before. But this particular V-1 never reached its destination. At precisely 03:48 hours, an American anti-aircraft battery positioned near Dymchurch locked its targeting radar onto the approaching weapon. The M1 90mm guns elevated. The crew made no manual adjustments to their aim. They didn't need to. The shells were already loaded. Standard high-explosive rounds, yes, but fitted with something the German engineers who designed the V-1 knew nothing about. Something that would have seemed impossible to them, impossible to their physics, impossible to their understanding of what technology could achieve in the crucible of total war. The guns fired. The shells streaked upward through the winter darkness at 2,700 feet per second. And at the mathematically perfect instant, not when the shell struck the V-1, but when it passed within 70 feet of the target, the fuse detonated. The explosion shredded the flying bomb's thin aluminum fuselage. Fragments of the pulse jet engine tumbled toward empty farmland. The warhead, its firing mechanism destroyed, fell inert into a frozen field where it would later be recovered by bomb disposal teams. No crater, no casualties, no vengeance. The crew at Dymchurch logged the kill and prepared for the next target. They did not celebrate. By January 1945, this had become routine. To understand what happened in that dark January sky, we must travel backward through the desperate mathematics of aerial warfare to June 1944, when the V-1 campaign began. The flying bombs came first on the night of June 12th, less than a week after Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Hitler's much-promised Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, were finally being unleashed. Not as game-changers that would reverse Germany's crumbling military position, but as instruments of terror, as punishment, as vengeance. The V-1 was, in its essence, a pilotless aircraft carrying an 870-pound Amatol warhead. Its pulse jet engine was crude, loud, and terrifyingly simple, a tube that gulped air, mixed it with fuel, and ignited it in rapid succession, creating that distinctive buzzing sound that gave the weapon its nickname. The guidance system was equally primitive by modern standards: a gyroscopic autopilot, a magnetic compass, and a small propeller in the nose that counted down distance traveled. When the propeller reached the preset number of rotations corresponding to the distance to London, it triggered a mechanism that locked the elevator controls, tipping the bomb into its final dive. Accuracy was terrible, the circular error probable. The radius within which 50% of the weapons would land was approximately 10 miles. But accuracy didn't matter when your target was one of the largest cities in the world, and your objective was terror rather than precision. Between June and March 1945, Germany launched approximately 10,000 V-1s toward England. Of these, roughly 2,400 reached the Greater London area. They killed 6,184 people. They wounded 1,781 more. They destroyed 23,000 homes. The British response was systematic and desperate. They established a defensive belt stretching from the Channel coast inland toward London. First came fighter command squadrons, Spitfires, Tempests, and Mosquitoes that would race to intercept the bombs, matching their speed and tipping them off course with their wingtips or shooting them down over unpopulated areas. Then came the anti-aircraft batteries, positioned in a dense line along the coast. Then the barrage balloons, their steel cables forming an aerial obstacle course. Finally, a second line of anti-aircraft guns positioned around London itself. It was a defense in depth, but it was also an admission of terrible arithmetic. In the early weeks of the V-1 campaign, only about 24% of the flying bombs were being destroyed. The rest got through. And everyone that got through had a ton of high explosive aimed, however imprecisely, at civilians. The gun crews did their best, but conventional anti-aircraft gunnery in 1944 was an exercise in educated guesswork wrapped in mathematics and desperation. A trained crew would track the target visually or with radar, calculate its speed, altitude, and trajectory, set the fuse on their shells to detonate at the calculated altitude, aim the gun to meet the target at a predicted future position, and fire. The shell would arc upward through the sky, its mechanical time fuse counting down the seconds until it reached the preset altitude and detonated. If the calculations were correct, if the target maintained its course and speed, if the weather conditions hadn't shifted, if the shell left the barrel at exactly the expected velocity, the target might pass through the fragmenting shrapnel cloud and be damaged. Might. The statistics were grim. A conventional anti-aircraft battery might need to fire thousands of rounds to achieve a single kill against a fast-moving aerial target. Against the V-1, with its small cross-section and high speed, the odds were even worse. Crews fired and fired and fired, watching their shells explode in the wrong place at the wrong time, watching the bombs fly through the gaps in their defensive fire, watching the red glow of pulse jets disappear toward London. And then, in late August 1944, everything changed. The weapon that changed the mathematics of aerial warfare had been conceived in the most unlikely of places. The peacetime research laboratories of American universities, where scientists who had never worn uniforms were trying to solve a problem that wouldn't become urgent until war transformed their theoretical exercises into matters of life and death. The proximity fuse, officially designated the variable time or VT fuse, was a miniature radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit into the nose of an artillery shell, robust enough to survive being fired from a cannon, and sophisticated enough to detect when it was passing near a target and detonate at the optimal moment. It was, by the standards of 1940s technology, a miracle. The development had begun in 1940 at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism in Washington under Section T of the National Defense Research Committee. The challenge was almost absurd. Create a vacuum tube radio transmitter that could survive accelerations of 20,000 times the force of gravity when a shell was fired, that could function reliably in the extreme cold of high altitude, that could distinguish between a genuine target and ground clutter or clouds, and that could do all of this for less than $15 per unit, so it could be mass-produced by the millions. Conventional vacuum tubes shattered under the G-forces of firing. The researchers developed new designs with miniaturized components, rugged construction, and innovative mounting systems. The radio had to be small enough to fit in a shell fuse, but powerful enough to detect aircraft at useful ranges. The circuit had to be simple enough to manufacture by the thousands, but sophisticated enough to avoid false triggering. The battery had to activate only when the shell was fired and provide power for the brief seconds of the shell's flight. By 1941, they had working prototypes. By 1942, they were in production. By 1943, they were being used by the U.S. Navy against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific, where they proved devastatingly effective. The Fuze's existence was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, ranking alongside the Manhattan Project and the breaking of Enigma. Shells fitted with VT fuses were initially forbidden from being fired over land, where duds might fall into enemy hands. They were to be used only over water, where failed rounds would sink and take their secrets with them. But by 1944, as the V-1 campaign intensified, the calculations shifted. The threat to London was immediate and growing. The Allied invasion of Europe was underway, making the risk of a dud fuse falling into German hands less catastrophic. They had no time to reverse engineer and mass-produce the technology before their war industries were overrun. In August 1944, the decision was made. VT fuses would be deployed in the anti-aircraft defenses of southern England against the V-1 menace. The German High Command knew something had changed. They could see it in the statistics. Suddenly, in late August, the number of V-1s reaching their targets began to plummet. Flying bombs that should have penetrated the coastal defenses were being destroyed in unprecedented numbers. But they didn't know why. They suspected improved radar, better trained crews, new tactics. They had no idea that American-made shells were now detonating themselves automatically, without human intervention, at the precise instant of maximum lethality. The VT fuse operated on an elegant principle. The small radio transmitter in the nose of the shell broadcast a continuous radio signal as the shell flew through the air. When the shell approached a large metal object, like an aircraft or a flying bomb, the radio waves reflected back. The receiver detected this reflected signal, and when the strength of the return reached a threshold indicating optimal detonation range, an electronic switch triggered the explosive charge. The entire process happened in microseconds. No human decision required, no mechanical timing needed, just physics, electronics, and explosive chemistry working in perfect synchronization. For the gun crews, the difference was transformative. They still had to aim, still had to track the target, still had to fire at the right general moment. But they no longer needed to calculate precise fuse settings. They no longer needed to predict exactly where the target would be when their shell reached detonation altitude. The shell itself would do that. The shell would wait, patient and electronic and relentless, until it was close enough, and then it would detonate at the mathematically optimal instant. The effectiveness was staggering. Batteries equipped with VT fuses saw their kill rates multiply by factors of 3, 4, 5. Shells that had once exploded uselessly in empty air now found their targets with mechanical certainty. By the final months of the V-1 campaign, British and American anti-aircraft defenses were achieving success rates that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. On January 17, 1945, the day that would later appear in the classified after-action reports as a statistical outlier, an impossibility that was nonetheless documented, verified, and filed away for future study, weather conditions over the English Channel were typical for midwinter: low overcast, temperature just above freezing, visibility moderate. Not ideal for visual tracking, but the radar worked regardless of clouds. The Germans launched their attacks in waves throughout the day and night. The V-1s came singly and in groups, fired from their launch ramps in occupied territory or, increasingly, from Heinkel. Ahishi 111 bombers flying over the North Sea, a tactic developed after Allied advances overran most of the ground-based launch sites. Some carried standard warheads, some carried experimental payloads. All of them were aimed with characteristic imprecision toward London and the surrounding areas. What made January 17th exceptional was not the volume of attacks, other days had seen more launches, but what happened when those flying bombs encountered the defensive belt. The anti-aircraft batteries, now fully equipped with VT-fused ammunition and thoroughly trained in their use, engaged target after target. The radar operators tracked, the gun crews aimed, the shells fired, arced upward, and detonated themselves at precisely the right instant. By the end of that single day, the statistics were almost unbelievable. Of the V-1s that entered the engagement zone of the anti-aircraft batteries, 82% were destroyed, not turned back, not damaged, destroyed, shredded in midair by proximity-fused shells that detonated at mathematically calculated optimal distances from their targets, 82%. To put this in perspective, in June 1944, when the V-1 campaign began, the anti-aircraft batteries were achieving roughly 17% kills. In early August, before VT fuses were deployed in quantity, the rate had climbed to about 24%. By late August, with VT fuses in use, it reached 74%. But January 17, 1945, represented a peak, a single day where training, technology, and circumstance aligned to create a defensive efficiency that bordered on perfection. The German observers could not understand it. The flying bombs left their ramps or were released from their parent aircraft. They flew on course, engines running normally, autopilots functioning, and then, somewhere over the Channel coast or just inland, they simply exploded. Not hit by visible fighter aircraft, not struck by shells, the crews saw no impacts, just sudden, catastrophic structural failure, as if the bombs were destroying themselves. In Berlin, in the offices of the Luftwaffe High Command and in the bunkers where the V-weapon program was managed, analysts pored over the reports. The numbers made no sense. The British couldn't have suddenly become this effective with conventional anti-aircraft fire. The improvement was too dramatic, too sudden. There had to be a new technology, a new weapon system. But what? They suspected radar improvements. They suspected new ammunition types. Some analysts speculated about directed energy weapons. Perhaps the British had developed some form of radio beam that could interfere with the V-1's electrical systems. The truth, that American engineers had created a shell that could think in its limited electronic way, that could sense its environment and make a decision about when to explode, was beyond their conceptual framework. They had nothing comparable. German radio fuse research existed, but it was years behind, focused on different principles, and starved of resources as the Reich's industrial capacity crumbled under Allied bombing. The soldiers who maintained and operated the V-1 launch sites were not told the success rates of their weapons. They loaded the flying bombs onto their launch ramps, checked the fuel, set the autopilots, verified the guidance systems, and sent the weapons on their way. They heard the pulse jets roar to life. They watched the bombs accelerate down the ramps and climb into the sky. They knew the general direction was toward England, toward London, toward the enemy. They did not know that only a fraction of the weapons they launched would reach their targets. They did not know that the defensive technologies arrayed against them had evolved beyond the capabilities imagined by their own weapons designers. This was the peculiar blindness of the late-war German military. Fighting with weapons conceived in a moment of strength, ignorant of how thoroughly the technological advantage had shifted. The V-1 had been designed in 1942, when Germany still held most of Europe, when its industries were intact, when victory seemed possible. By 1945, when the campaign reached its desperate final months, the weapon was obsolete before it launched. Not because its design had changed, the V-1 of January 1945 was essentially identical to the V-1 of June 1944, but because the defensive environment had evolved around it. The German soldiers expected their vengeance weapons to terrorize London, to break British morale, to demonstrate that even in retreat, even facing invasion, the Reich could still strike at its enemies. What they got instead was a one-way journey into an invisible technological gauntlet that destroyed their weapons with mechanical efficiency. There are no recorded statements from V-1 launch crews expressing doubt about their weapons' effectiveness. Military discipline and propaganda censorship ensured silence, but we know from post-war interrogations that many suspected the truth. They saw the resources being poured into the V-weapon programs, resources that might have been used for conventional aircraft, for tanks, for the materiel of defensive warfare. They saw the increasing desperation of the launch schedules, the orders to fire everything available regardless of weather or tactical situation. They knew, in the way soldiers know when their cause is failing, that the vengeance weapons were not achieving vengeance. They were achieving nothing but the expenditure of fuel and explosives in a losing cause. What the German military could not see, because they lacked access to the British and American defensive statistics, was just how completely they had lost the technological race. The VT Fuse represented not just an incremental improvement in anti-aircraft technology, but a fundamental shift in the nature of aerial combat. For the first time in military history, defensive weapons could respond to their environment faster than human reflexes, could make detonation decisions with electronic precision, could turn the sky itself into an automated killing zone. The British Home Office recorded the statistics with methodical precision. Every V-1 launch detected, every interception attempt logged, every kill verified. The numbers told a story of escalating defensive dominance. June 1944, 17% destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. July 19%. August, the month VT Fuses arrived in quantity, 47%. September, 60%. October, 67%. November, 73%. December, 79%. And then January, with that single extraordinary day when 82% fell to the guns. These were not just numbers. Each percentage point represented flying bombs that never reached London, warheads that fell into fields instead of neighborhoods, explosive force that killed crops instead of civilians. By January 1945, the statistical expectation for a V-1 launched toward England was no longer, will it reach London, but where will it be destroyed? The defensive belt had become a grinder that consumed vengeance weapons with industrial efficiency. The symbolic object of this story, the recurring element that represents the profound technological and ideological gap between the Allied and Axis powers, is not the VT Fuse itself, but something more fundamental: information, the ability to gather it, process it, share it, and act on it faster than your enemy. Every V-1 that crossed the Channel coast was immediately detected by the British radar network, its position radioed to plotting rooms, its trajectory calculated and disseminated to gun batteries and fighter squadrons within seconds. Every interception was logged, every kill verified, every failure analyzed. The data flowed upward and downward through the command structure continuously, allowing for rapid adjustment of tactics, redeployment of resources, refinement of techniques. The Germans had radar, they had calculating machines, they had competent analysts. But they lacked the integrated system, the seamless flow of information from sensor to shooter, the institutional culture that valued data-driven decision-making over ideological wishful thinking. They launched their weapons into a void and hoped. The Allies launched their defenses with mathematical precision and knew. This information advantage manifested in countless small ways that accumulated into strategic dominance. American and British intelligence services tracked V-1 launch sites, bombing them regularly, forcing the Germans into an exhausting cycle of rebuilding and relocation. Captured V-1s were analyzed in detail, their guidance systems reverse-engineered, their vulnerabilities documented and shared with defensive units. When the Germans modified their tactics, launching at night, launching from aircraft, varying their approach routes, the defensive system adapted within days. The German military, by contrast, operated increasingly in darkness. Allied bombing had disrupted their communication networks. The shrinking territory under Reich control made coordination difficult. Security paranoia meant that information was compartmentalized, with V-weapon program details kept secret even from other military branches. Launch crews didn't know success rates. Analysts didn't have access to accurate damage assessments. High command made decisions based on optimistic estimates and propaganda requirements rather than battlefield realities. By January 1945, The information asymmetry was total. The Allies knew more about the V-1 campaign, its launch rates, its success rates, its impact, than the Germans who were conducting it. This was the true technological superiority, not just better weapons, but better systems for using weapons, better methods for learning from experience, better institutions for turning data into decision, and decision into action. The transformation in German military thinking that the V-weapon campaigns were supposed to produce never materialized. Hitler and Goebbels had promised that the Vergeltungswaffen would break British morale, would force Churchill to negotiate, would demonstrate that German technological superiority remained intact despite military reversals. The reality was precisely the opposite. British civilians who had endured the Blitz of 1940–41, who had lived through years of rationing and blackouts and separation from loved ones, absorbed the V-1 attacks with grim resilience. The bombs killed and maimed and destroyed, yes, but they did not create panic. They did not produce a political crisis. They did not accomplish anything militarily significant. Instead, they reinforced the righteousness of the Allied cause. Here was the enemy, reduced to launching robot bombs at civilians because they lacked the Air Force to attack legitimate military targets. For the Allied military planners and political leaders, the V-1 campaign and its eventual defeat provided a different kind of lesson. That technological innovation, when combined with industrial capacity and information superiority, could overcome even the most dangerous threats. The success of the VT-Fuse program validated the massive investments in military research and development, the collaboration between military, academic, and industrial institutions, the willingness to take risks on unproven technologies. The fuse itself was an object lesson in American technological philosophy. It was not elegant. It was not efficient in terms of materials or complexity. Each fused shell cost significantly more than a conventional round. But it was effective, and in wartime, effectiveness mattered more than elegance. It could be mass-produced. It could be distributed by the millions. It could be used by ordinary soldiers without specialized training. It was, in essence, the application of American industrial might and scientific pragmatism to the problem of aerial warfare. The Germans, by contrast, had poured resources into the V-weapons expecting technological silver bullets, superweapons that would single-handedly reverse their military fortunes. The V-1 was followed by the V-2 ballistic missile, an even more sophisticated weapon that was even less effective strategically, consuming resources that might have been used for conventional arms. This was the pattern of late-war German weapons development, increasingly sophisticated systems that delivered diminishing returns designed more to impress and intimidate than to achieve practical military objectives. By January 1945, the V-1 campaign was effectively over, though launches would continue sporadically into March. The launch sites in France and Belgium had been overrun by advancing Allied forces. The modified aerial launch campaign from Heinkel bombers was too dangerous for the air crews and too ineffective to justify the losses. The defensive systems arrayed against the flying bombs had achieved such efficiency that continued launches were simply wasteful. The epilogue of the V-1 story arrived not with military surrender, but with statistical silence. In March 1945, the last documented V-1 attack on England occurred. No dramatic final strike, no climactic battle. Just the absence of the buzzing pulse jet sound that had terrorized southern England for 9 months. The defensive belt that had been constructed at such cost, the radar stations, the anti-aircraft batteries, the fighter squadrons, the barrage balloon units, stood ready. But there was nothing left to defend against. The soldiers of the gun batteries that had achieved that remarkable 82% success rate on January 17th did not receive special recognition. There were no parades for defensive victories in the closing months of the war. They packed up their equipment as the front lines moved east, redeployed to other theaters, or simply went home when victory came in May. The VT fuses they had used were collected, inventoried, and either shipped to the Pacific Theater, where they were revolutionizing anti-aircraft defense against kamikaze attacks, or stored in depots against future need. The German soldiers who had maintained the launch sites and prepared the flying bombs were captured or retreated deeper into the shrinking Reich. In post-war interrogations, when they learned the true success rates of their weapons, many expressed shock. They had believed the propaganda. They had imagined their labors were contributing to eventual victory, or at least to meaningful retaliation against the enemy. To learn that roughly 4 out of every 5 V-1s they launched in that final period were being destroyed before reaching their targets was to understand how completely they had been defeated, not just militarily, but technologically. The civilians of London who had lived under the threat of the doodlebugs received no formal accounting of how many. Weapons had been stopped on their behalf. The Home Office reports were classified. The existence of the VT fuse remained secret for years after the war. What the people knew was that the attacks had stopped, that the particular terror of hearing an engine cut overhead and waiting for the explosion was over, that they had survived one more attempt to break their will. And what of the technology itself, the proximity fuse that had made that January day's 82% success rate possible? It did not end with the war. The VT fuse became the foundation for an entire generation of air defense systems. The principles it embodied, using electronics to make real-time decisions, automating the terminal phase of weapons employment, sensing the environment, and adapting accordingly, became fundamental to modern warfare. Missiles that guide themselves to targets, smart bombs that adjust their trajectory in flight, defensive systems that engage threats faster than human reaction time allows. All of these trace their conceptual lineage back to those miniature radio transmitters packed into artillery shells in 1942. The broader lesson of January 17, 1945, extends beyond the specific technology of proximity fuses or the tactical problem of intercepting flying bombs. It speaks to the nature of technological competition between free and authoritarian societies, to the advantages of transparent information, flow versus propaganda and secrecy, to the power of collaborative research versus centralized command. The United States developed the VT fuse through a network of university laboratories, commercial manufacturers, and military organizations working in coordinated partnership. Scientists published papers, albeit classified ones. Engineers shared problems and solutions. Military users provided feedback that improved the design. The whole system functioned as a learning organization, constantly iterating and improving. Germany developed the V-1 through a hierarchical military-industrial system dominated by political considerations and personal rivalries. Development programs competed for Hitler's attention and favor. Critical feedback was unwelcome if it contradicted optimistic projections. The weapons were designed to fulfill propaganda promises as much as military requirements. The system was optimized for spectacle rather than effectiveness. These organizational cultures produced predictable results. The Allies created weapons that worked, that could be manufactured in quantity, that solved real tactical problems, and that improved with use and feedback. The Germans created weapons that impressed, that fulfilled ideological requirements, that generated propaganda value, but that ultimately failed to achieve strategic objectives. On quiet nights in Kent, in the years immediately after the war, residents would sometimes hear a sound that made them tense involuntarily, an aircraft engine with an unfamiliar rhythm. The memory of the doodlebug was still fresh, enough to trigger that primal response. The sound means danger. But it was only a civilian aircraft passing overhead, or the wind through trees, or imagination playing tricks with memory. The actual threat was gone, destroyed by shells that detonated themselves at precisely the right instant, stopped by a technology the enemy never understood, even as it ground their vengeance campaign into statistical irrelevance. The gun crews who achieved that 82% success rate on January 17, 1945, were armed with mathematics made physical. Every shell they fired carried within it a miniature triumph of American engineering, vacuum tubes that survived forces that should have shattered them, radio circuits that made life and death decisions in microseconds, batteries that activated at the instant of firing and provided power for exactly as long as needed. These were not miracle weapons in the sense that German propaganda promised miracles. They were miracle weapons in the sense that they made the impossible routine, that they turned technological sophistication into tactical reliability, that they gave ordinary soldiers the power to defeat threats that conventional weapons could barely touch. The Germans never knew. They suspected. They theorized. They wrote reports about unexplained defensive effectiveness and mysterious weapon failures. But they never captured an intact VT fuse. They never reverse-engineered the technology. They never understood that they were fighting against an enemy that had learned to make shells think in their limited electronic way, that had learned to automate the most critical split-second decision in aerial combat. This was the hidden story of January 17, 1945. Not just that 82% of V-1s were destroyed in a single day, but that this achievement represented a culmination of everything that distinguished the Allied war effort from its enemy. Cooperation over competition, information over propaganda, pragmatic engineering over ideological wishful thinking, continuous improvement over static doctrine, the ability to turn scientific research into mass-produced weapons in the time it took the enemy to launch a terror campaign that backfired. The V-1 was supposed to be a weapon of vengeance. Instead, it became a target, a flying testament to the futility of technological terrorism against an enemy with superior science, superior industry, and superior systems for turning both into battlefield dominance. Every doodlebug that exploded over the Channel coast, shredded by a proximity-fused shell, was a small but undeniable proof that the war's outcome was already decided. Not by courage, though courage was abundant on both sides. Not by will, though will was tested and found sufficient. But by the ability to innovate, to manufacture, to learn, and to apply technology at scale, the essential advantages of free societies at war. On that January day, the sky above England became a laboratory demonstration of this truth. The bombs came. The shells rose to meet them. And in the microseconds of electronic decision-making inside those fused projectiles, the future of warfare was being written, automated, precise, relentless, and utterly beyond the comprehension of an enemy still fighting with the tactics and technologies of a war they had already lost. The number remains, 82%. Not perfect, but devastating. Not flawless, but sufficient. A single day's triumph of American technology over German vengeance, achieved by soldiers who never knew they were making history, using weapons the enemy never understood, in defense of civilians who never learned how close they came to disaster and how thoroughly they were protected. That is the legacy of January 17, 1945, the day the machines learned to defend democracy and did so with mathematical certainty.